There is a particular feeling that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive as panic or sadness. It arrives as a quiet awareness, often in ordinary moments, when you realize you are present but not fully included. You're standing in a room with other people, listening, nodding, smiling at the right times, yet something inside you remains slightly removed. Not disconnected enough to leave, not connected enough to belong. Just apart. You might notice it at a gathering where everyone seems relaxed, laughing easily, while you're mentally rehearsing how to respond if someone speaks to you directly. Or during a conversation with people you know well, when you suddenly feel like you're watching yourself from the outside, performing a version of connection rather than experiencing it. Nothing is wrong on the surface. No one is being unkind. And yet, the sense of being an outsider lingers, subtle and persistent. This feeling doesn't usually come with a clear explanation. In fact, that's part of what makes it so unsettling. You may tell yourself that you're just tired, or that this group isn't really your kind of people, or that you're overthinking things. But the feeling has a way of following you. New environments, new relationships, even moments that should feel intimate or familiar. Somehow, the distance remains. At some point, usually alone, the question forms, not dramatically, but quietly, with a hint of resignation. Why do I feel like an outsider everywhere? Why does this sense of not belonging show up no matter who I'm with, even among friends, family, or partners? This question is rarely asked out loud. It carries too much implication. Too much fear that the answer might confirm something deeply personal, that there is something inherently off about you, something that prevents you from fitting in the way others seem to. But the truth is far less simple, and far more human. Feeling like an outsider is not always about the people around you. Often, it's about the internal expectations you carry into every interaction, expectations shaped long before you had the words to name them. Many people who feel like outsiders have a history of emotional misattunement. This doesn't mean obvious neglect or overt rejection. Often, it's much quieter than that. It's growing up in environments where your emotional signals weren't consistently noticed or responded to. Where you learned, slowly and subtly, that being yourself didn't reliably lead to connection. As a result, you adapted. You became observant. You learned to read rooms quickly, to adjust your tone, your opinions, even your personality depending on who you were with. On the surface, this looks like social skill. And in many ways it is. But underneath, something else was forming. A belief that connection requires modification, and that belonging is conditional. So you enter social spaces already braced. You're present, but part of you stays alert, monitoring how you're coming across. Are you saying too much? Too little? Are you being interesting enough? Too intense? Not enough? This internal monitoring creates a distance between you and the moment. You're involved, but not immersed. Over time, this distance becomes familiar. It feels safer to stand slightly apart than to risk stepping fully in and discovering that you don't quite fit. And so the outsider identity quietly takes shape, not as a conscious choice, but as a protective position. This pattern often reveals itself in small, everyday moments. You're in a group conversation, and by the time you've decided what you want to say, the moment has passed. You tell yourself it wasn't important anyway. You're invited somewhere and feel both relieved and disappointed when you can't go. You're in a close relationship, yet there's a part of you that never quite relaxes, never fully assumes that you're wanted just as you are. Even when inclusion is offered, it can feel oddly unreal. Compliments don't land. Invitations feel polite rather than genuine. Affection feels temporary, as if it could disappear at any moment. And so you keep a small emotional distance, just enough to soften the impact if it does. This is where internalized alienation takes root. Not because you don't want connection, but because you learn not to expect it to be stable. Somewhere along the way, your system decided that belonging was uncertain, and that staying slightly separate was the safest way to navigate that uncertainty. What's important to understand is that this sense of being an outsider isn't evidence that you don't belong. It's evidence that belonging once felt unreliable. For many people, the outsider feeling becomes so familiar that it starts to feel like identity. I've always been like this. I'm just not a people person. I don't really fit anywhere. These statements feel factual, but they are often descriptions of adaptation, not essence. There is usually a moment, subtle but significant, when this realization begins to surface. Perhaps you notice that even in groups where you are clearly accepted, the feeling remains. Or you recognize that the distance you feel isn't coming from others' behavior, but from an internal barrier that activates automatically. This is the emotional pivot point. The recognition that the outsider feeling isn't caused by who you're with, but by what you're expecting. Or more precisely, what you're not expecting. The key insight is this: many people who feel like outsiders everywhere are not lacking the ability to connect. They are carrying an internal expectation of disconnection. An expectation learned early, reinforced quietly, and rarely questioned. When you expect not to belong, you position yourself accordingly. You stay slightly guarded, slightly removed. You don't fully arrive. And then, inevitably, the experience matches the expectation, not because it was inevitable, but because it was anticipated. This realization can feel unsettling. It challenges the long-held belief that the problem is external, the wrong people, the wrong environments, the wrong version of yourself. Instead, it points inward, not in blame, but in understanding. From here, the experience of feeling like an outsider begins to change. Not suddenly, and not completely. But it softens. It becomes something you can observe rather than something that defines you. You start to notice when the familiar distance appears. When you hold back a little too early. When you assume, without evidence, that you don't quite belong. This noticing isn't about correcting yourself or forcing connection. It's about recognizing the pattern with compassion. Seeing it as something that once helped you navigate uncertainty, rather than something that proves you're fundamentally separate. In this reflective space, self-doubt begins to loosen its grip. The narrative shifts from, "There's something wrong with me," to, "This is something I learned." And what is learned, however deeply, carries the possibility of being re-examined. The closing truth of this reflection is quiet, but it carries weight. Feeling like an outsider isn't about where you stand in a room, or how others see you. It's about what you learn to expect from connection, and how those expectations continue to shape your experience long after the original conditions have passed. There is no demand here to change who you are. Only an invitation to sit with the recognition that the distance you feel has a history, a purpose, and a meaning. And that understanding it is not the end of the journey, but it is where clarity begins.